When that disaster happened at Munich in 1958, I was a young kid training at Celtic Park and playing in the junior football at that particular time with Duntoker Hibs. And we'd go to Celtic Park for 6 o'clock. And I remember getting a trolley bus, not many people would remember those, and then a tram car from Glasgow Cross up to Celtic Park. And I saw the placards, Manchester United and plane crash, but even in those days, you wouldn't read anything into that. You think, oh, that's sensationalism from the media as usual. But I didn't know what had really happened until I got to Celtic Park and people were talking about the accident and who had been killed and who had not been killed. Everybody in Scotland, and I'm talking about everybody, was in despair because of the young players and the greatness of them. Everybody knew them.
I'm Jimmy Murphy Jr. I'm one of Jimmy Murphy's 4 sons. He was recruited to Manchester United by Matt Busby and was Matt Busby's assistant for over 25 years. And Matt and my father's plans were to recruit their own players and develop their own style of football with younger people rather than older people. When my father went to West Brom and Matt went to Liverpool and Manchester City, they weren't looked after like the youngsters are today. So they decided when they recruited the youngsters, not only would they coach them in football, but they looked after them as a family. And if you see any films about them, players talking, they'll say that Jimmy and Matt treated them like family and like their sons. And as Bobby once said, I think they treated him better than his sons were treated, because Bobby would see more of my father than I did.
I mean, a lot of people, I was a kid in Glasgow at that particular time. We didn't have a television, but somebody would have a television, and we'd heard so much about this young team that you'd go and, if they were playing particular big matches or something like that, well, I saw Duncan Edwards play for Scotland, for England against Scotland a couple of times. You knew about them.
After the conclusion of the Second World War, Manchester United appointed Matt Busby as its first team manager, and with the help of stars such as Jimmy Murphy, he guided United to league success in 1952 and back-to-back successes in 1956 and 57, also winning the FA Cup in 1948.
Busby's side had an average age of just 22, earning them that famous title of the Busby Babes.
The brand of football that United employed was fast, attacking and most importantly, successful. In the 56-57 season, United became the first English team to compete in the European Cup, despite objection from the Football League, who had denied Chelsea the same opportunity the prior season. United subsequently exited the competition after losing to Real Madrid in the semi-final, despite recording the club's biggest win margin against Anderlecht in the previous round. But Busby was determined to achieve his goal of conquering Europe with his young side. The following season, Busby's side was thriving in Europe, again having played an away leg to Red Star Belgrade to cement their place in the semi-final. United, with spirits high, were to fly home for their weekend league fixture against Wolverhampton Wanderers, with pressure from the FA to be back in England at least 48 hours before kick-off. Failure to do so would result in a points deduction and a fine due to the association's disliking for the competition. What unfolded on the runway in Munich after 2 failed takeoffs would change the history of Manchester United and the face of football forever.
On the fringe of a Munich airport lies the wreckage of an airliner, still smouldering from a crash in which 21 people were killed. Tragedy enough at any time. But in that plane were a group of young men who were almost the personal friends of millions. Manchester United, the finest soccer team Britain has produced since the war. And 7 of them died in the crash. 10 others, as well as their famous manager, Matt Busby, were injured. Some so seriously that their lives hung in the balance.
"23 people lost their lives in the tragedy, including United stars Eddie Coleman, Tommy Taylor and Billy Whelan, with many others being rushed to a nearby hospital. Among those were Matt Busby and midfielder Duncan Edwards. Despite fighting for his life, sitting up and talking to best friend Bobby Charlton, Duncan died in hospital 15 days later.
United were left without a squad or manager. The club officials even considered closing the club down until the end of the season. But this couldn't stand for Jimmy, who knew that people needed Manchester United now more than ever.
When that disaster happened at Munich in 1958, I was a young kid training at Celtic Park and playing in the junior football at that particular time with Duntoker Hibs. And I saw the placards, Manchester United and plane crash, but even in those days, you wouldn't read anything into that. You think, no, that's sensationalism from the media as usual. But I didn't know what had really happened until I got to Celtic Park and people were talking about the accident and who had been killed and who had not been killed. Everybody in Scotland, and I'm talking about everybody, was in despair because of the young players and the greatness of them. Everybody knew them.
I lived within half a mile of school. 6 children by then. My sister was at school about 2 miles away. My younger brother was at school about 6 miles away. So I was the only one at home when it came on the radio. And my mother's first reaction was, "Oh God, your father." And I said, "He wasn't on the plane." Bert Wally went in my father's place, and that's the only time he's been with the first team. And he died instantly. So when I see Bert's daughter, I always feel quite sad, because she's younger than me, so she's just an only child, and then lost her dad at a very, very young age. But the secretary was dead, so his secretary assistant, he had to deal with all these deaths, with most of the players not being on the telephone. So for them to contact the people in Yorkshire to tell them that the son was injured or dying or dead was horrendous. But Manchester was just stunned. It's quite horrific, really.
After weeks of recovery, Matt was ready to come home.
Jimmy took charge of United for the remainder of the season, borrowing players from clubs up and down the country in an attempt just to simply keep the club afloat. United did him proud by reaching the final of the FA Cup, with survivors Bobby Charlton and Harry Gregg featuring.
The miracle was just reaching the final, though they did lose valiantly to Bolton Wanderers 2-0. Matt couldn't rest, as his job wasn't finished. He took charge of United the following season, taking them to league wins in 65 and 67, with his new star-studded side featuring the likes of Dennis Law, Paddy Crerand, George Best and Bobby Charlton. But Matt strived to finish the story he started just over 10 years prior with his famous Babes. Matt had eyes only for the European Cup. After a superb run beating Real Madrid in the semi-final 4-3 on aggregate, United were to face Benfica in the final on home soil at Wembley. They were on the cusp of greatness.
United kicked off, launching directly into attack as they often did. Benfica soon felt their way into the game though, with Eusebio giving the Reds a shock as he hit the crossbar. Despite waves of attack, the sides reached half-time locked at 0-0. With the eyes of the world on Wembley and the support of an entire country behind Busby's boys, they started the second half with history in their sights and the Babes in mind. United's football was full of fire. Best and co were in terrific form. After a loose ball from Best out to the left wing, the ball found itself with Sadler. He held it up towards the penalty spot as Bobby Charlton crafted football magic. An explosion of euphoria filled Wembley as United continued to probe for a second. It was with little time to go though that Benfica found a goal of their own to halt United's and Matt's celebrations. With less than 10 minutes to go, United faced a bombardment of Benfica chances, with Stepney standing firm. 90 minutes up and still deadlock. Matt and Jimmy looked upon their tiring squad of League and FA Cup winners, knowing that 30 more minutes could make them legends of the game. A brief team talk from the gaffer and encouragement from Jimmy, the man who had saved United from the brink, inspired a performance like no other. As quick as a flash in George Best style, he rounded the keeper and slotted the ball home. United were in front again. Kidd soon found himself heading home a rebounded cross to claim United's third. They were on fire. But were they done? Not on your life. A driven ball from wide found the right peg of Bobby Charlton, who swept it into the far corner. The man who came out on the other side of the Munich disaster, Mr. Manchester United, had scored the winning goal in the European Cup final, the very trophy his dear friends had lost their lives pursuing. United were kings of Europe, crafters of history. 10 years after the disaster, a club on the brink risen from the ashes to lift club football's biggest title.
You have great memories in football of certain things that happened, and that was obviously the best memory for me in football, of winning the European Cup 10 years in actual fact after the Munich disaster. And it was just a great, we all wanted to win it for Matt. That was the big thing. That was Matt's thing in life. Don't forget, Matt had entered Europe against all the people that ran football in this country. They didn't want British or English teams to enter the competition. They thought it would take away a bit of the maybe the glory of the Premiership or the First Division as it was in those days. But Matt had this great foresight to see that European football was the way forward, and the way forward not just for football in England, but for football and worldwide in actual fact. I mean, you look at it now, it's the biggest competition outside the World Cup is the European Cup. But we won it anyway, and eventually, and it was great. We had a banquet that night, and they were having the banquet anyway, Manchester United. Whether we won or lost, they invited all the families and all that sort of thing, mothers and fathers and relations and all that. And they had this big dinner in London. This was going to go on regardless of the results. So you're thinking to yourself, what's the point of it? Who's going to turn up if we get beat? So we won it anyway, and it was a great, great night. And I've never seen anybody as happy in all my life as Matt was that night. He kept singing "It's a Wonderful World." I think that was the Louis Armstrong hit at that particular time, and we couldn't shut him up. I'd never seen him like that. You always looked at Matt as a serious person, but that night he was going like the rest of us.
I think to myself, what a wonderful